I never thought I'd write this out, but here goes nothing. This story isn't mine. It belongs to a guy I used to know, a guy named Greg Thompson. Greg was one of those people who could slip through the cracks of life, invisible, unremarkable. You'd pass him on the street, and nothing about him would stick in your memory. But once you hear his story, you'll never forget him. I met Greg in a damp, half-empty dive bar in Akron, Ohio. The place had a smell, stale beer, wetwood, and a hint of something greasy that had probably soaked into the walls decades ago. It was the kind of joint where the jukebox always seemed to play the same scratchy rock ballads, and the regulars looked like they hadn't moved from their stools in years. Greg sat in the corner, hunched over a glass of whiskey with a napkin stuffed under the wobbling leg of his table. His eyes had a hollow, glassy look, like he was seeing something far beyond the nicotine-stained walls. Back then, Greg was just another overworked, underpaid cog in the corporate machine. He'd been grinding away at a local insurance firm, staring at spreadsheets until the numbers turned into a blur. His life was a conveyor belt of cheap coffee, fluorescent lights, and the clatter of keyboards. His boss, a guy named Frank Morton, was the kind of middle manager who wore cheap suits and got a kick out of reminding people how replaceable they were. Greg wasn't always like this, though. Before his world crumbled, he was a regular guy. He had a small apartment with a leaky faucet that never got fixed and a couch that sagged in the middle. He had a girlfriend once, too, a sweet, freckle-faced nurse named Sarah who made lasagna on Sundays and laughed with her whole body. But when the debt collectors started calling, and Greg's paycheck seemed to shrink while the bills piled up, things went south fast. Sarah stuck around longer than most would, but eventually she packed her things into a battered blue suitcase, kissed him on the cheek, and left. That's when Greg's life started to unravel. His landlord, a wiry old man named Mr. Harper, started leaving eviction notices taped to his door. His fridge was a wasteland of expired condiments and half-empty takeout containers. At work, Frank made it his mission to ride Greg harder than ever. Every mistake was a disaster, every delay a catastrophe. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Greg had messed up some report, a tiny error that anyone could have made, but Frank jumped on it like a shark to blood. The yelling drew everyone's attention, their heads poking up over cubicle walls like meerkats. Greg stood there, his shoulders hunched, cheeks burning, and something inside him just snapped. When Frank finally dismissed him, Greg didn't head back to his desk. Instead, he walked out of the office, past the confused stares of his coworkers, and into the rain. He wandered the city for hours, his soaked clothes clinging to him, his mind buzzing with static. At some point, he ended up near the edge of town, where the old industrial district bled into a stretch of overgrown woods. His feet found the path on their own, dragging him deeper into the thicket. And that's where he found the well. The well sat in a small clearing, surrounded by gnarled trees and tangled brush. The stone was old, covered in patches of moss and graffiti carved by bored teenagers. A rusty, chain-link fence sagged nearby, a remnant of some long-abandoned construction project. Greg stood there, staring at it, his breath coming out in white puffs. That's when he heard it, the voice. It was a low murmur, like someone speaking just below the edge of hearing. Greg turned, half expecting to see someone hiding in the bushes, but the clearing was empty. His skin prickled, and he took a step closer to the well. The voice grew clearer, each word sliding into his mind like a knife between the ribs. Put your money in silver. Short the tech stocks. Greg stumbled back, his heart hammering. He blinked, shook his head, and laughed at himself, a broken, ragged sound. He was losing it, hearing voices in the woods like some lunatic. But as he turned to leave, the voice came again, more insistent this time. Silver. Tech stocks. It's time to change your life, Greg. He froze. His name. The well had said his name. Greg's mind raced, a whirlwind of fear, curiosity, and a strange, creeping hope. What did he have to lose? His life was already a wreck, and if he was going crazy, maybe this madness was the only escape. So he sat by the well, his back against the cold stone, and he started to listen. That was the beginning. Greg didn't go back to work the next day, or the day after that. His phone buzzed with messages, first from Frank, dripping with faux concern, then from HR, and finally from the landlord reminding him that rent was past due. Greg ignored them all. Instead, he found himself back at the well, trudging through the dew-soaked underbrush, his shoes caked with mud. The voice greeted him before he even reached the clearing. It was clearer now, slipping through the crisp autumn air like smoke. Greg sat by the well, his back against the rough stone, and let the voice fill his mind. Buy silver. Not the flashy coins, but bars. Physical assets. The advice was sharp, precise. Greg didn't understand half of it, but the voice spoke with a confidence that settled his nerves. It told him which stocks to avoid, which companies were heading for a crash, and where to put the few dollars he had left. At first, Greg used what little savings he had. He opened a trading account on an app that offered a sign-up bonus, anything to scrape together enough to start. His hand shook as he made his first trade, eyes darting across the screen as if expecting it to burst into flames. To his shock, the voice was right. The tech stocks it warned him about plummeted overnight, their value dropping like stones. Meanwhile, silver prices inched upward. It wasn't a windfall, but Greg made enough to cover his next meal, then his rent. The more he listened, the more the voice rewarded him. Days turned into weeks. Greg became a ghost in his own life. He sold what little he had left, an old TV, a cracked smartphone, Sarah's leftover books. All of it went into investments. His days were a blur of trading screens and hushed conversations with the well. He'd sit there for hours, the cold seeping through his jacket, nodding along as the voice murmured secrets of the market. Oil futures are about to spike. There's a drought coming, invest in water infrastructure. And every time, the voice was right. One day, as Greg sat at the well, a group of teenagers wandered into the clearing. They were loud, shoving each other and laughing, the metal of their bikes clattering against the rocks. Greg stiffened, his conversation with the voice cut short. "Hey, dude, what are you doing?" One of them called out, a gangly kid with a red hoodie and a chipped tooth. Greg didn't answer. He just stared, his eyes sunken and unblinking. The kids lingered for a minute, muttering to each other, then bolted back down the path. Greg exhaled slowly, his fingers digging into the damp earth. "Be careful," the voice whispered. "People will never understand." Greg nodded. He started visiting the well only at night, slipping through the woods under the cover of darkness. His clothes hung off him, and his cheeks were hollow, but his bank account was swelling. He moved from a dingy studio to a modest one-bedroom apartment. He paid off his debts and started buying nicer clothes. He even got a new phone, though he only used it for trading. But the well remained his anchor. By winter, Greg's investments had snowballed. He made a few lucky plays in the commodities market, then rolled those gains into tech startups just as they launched. His account balance ticked upward, from thousands to tens of thousands. By the time the first snow dusted the city, Greg had crossed six figures. He celebrated alone, sitting on the edge of his new leather couch, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. The apartment was clean, almost sterile. He'd filled it with things he thought rich people were supposed to have: abstract art, a coffee table made of glass and steel, and a kitchen filled with gadgets he didn't know how to use. But beneath the surface, the paranoia festered. Greg started to worry that someone would find out. He blocked old friends on social media, cut off ties with his family, and let his phone go to voicemail. He kept his windows closed, his blinds drawn. The well became his only confidant. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks burst over the city, Greg sat by the well. Snowflakes drifted through the trees, settling on his shoulders. The voice spoke to him, soft and soothing, telling him about the market trends for the new year. Real estate, it said. Commercial properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. Greg listened, his breath fogging in the air, and took notes on a damp notepad. His fingers were numb, his nose red from the cold, but he didn't care. The well was all that mattered. The more he listened, the more the voice became a part of him. It wasn't just advice anymore. It was a lifeline, a purpose. Greg's life became a pattern. The markets by day, the well by night. He drove to the clearing in his new black SUV, the tires crunching over gravel, and sat by the well for hours. And every time, the voice was waiting. By spring, Greg Thompson was a millionaire. He'd followed the well's whispers into investments that no sane person would have touched. He bought shares in tiny biotech firms right before they announced breakthrough patents. He snapped up commercial properties in old industrial neighborhoods that were, almost overnight, earmarked for redevelopment. His money seemed to multiply with every trade, every decision guided by the murmurs in the dark. Greg upgraded his apartment again, this time to a sleek penthouse overlooking the city. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, giving him a view of the skyline that looked like something out of a postcard. His furniture was minimalist, clean lines, cool tones, everything precisely where it belonged. There were no personal touches, no family photos, no knickknacks. Just space, expensive and empty. But even as his fortune grew, Greg's world shrank. He became reclusive, his days an endless loop of market analysis and whispered conversations with the well. He rarely went out, and when he did, it was only to pick up supplies or visit his financial advisors. His name started circulating in investment circles. People whispered about the lucky recluse who always seemed to be a step ahead of the market. One day, as Greg sat in a high-rise conference room with a view that made the city look like a toy model, a sharply dressed man named Ethan Rhodes approached him. Ethan was a venture capitalist, the kind who wore tailored suits and spoke in polished, practiced tones. He had a habit of leaning in just a bit too close when he talked, his cologne sharp and citrusy. "Greg, you've got a gift," Ethan said, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "The kind of intuition money can't buy. You ever thought about starting your own fund? I could help." Greg's fingers tightened around his glass of water. The idea was tempting: more money, more influence. But the well's voice echoed in his mind, a low growl of warning. "Don't trust him. He wants what you have." Greg's lips twitched into a thin smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for partners." Ethan's expression didn't falter, but a shadow of something: disappointment, frustration, crossed his eyes. "All right, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Greg didn't respond. He just sipped his water and watched as Ethan walked away, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. That night, Greg drove to the well in his new Lamborghini. The car was a deep, shadowy gray with a low growl that purred through the empty streets. The city lights reflected off its glossy surface as he wound his way to the edge of town, where the trees swallowed the road and the world went quiet. The well was waiting. Greg knelt by the stone edge, his knees pressing into the damp earth. "I turned him down, just like you said." The voice hummed approvingly. "Good. They'll try to take what you have, but they don't understand. Only you can hear me." A shiver ran through Greg. "Why me?" he asked, not for the first time. There was a long, heavy silence. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. "Because you listened when no one else would." Greg nodded, his breath clouding in the cool night air. The well's voice filled the quiet, whispering secrets of the next big market shifts, guiding him further down the path to wealth. But as his fortune grew, so did the cracks in his reality. Greg started seeing things: shadows in the corners of his vision, faces in the glass of his penthouse windows. His reflection seemed to move a beat too late, its eyes darker than they should have been. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echoes of the well's voice still curling through his mind. He began to notice people watching him: Ethan's face in a crowded cafe, a woman from his old office at the grocery store, Frank Morton's silhouette on a street corner. Greg wasn't sure if they were really there or if his mind was unraveling. One afternoon, as he walked through his penthouse, Greg saw a figure standing on his balcony. His heart slammed against his ribs. The glass door was closed, the lock still in place, but the figure stood there, motionless, staring out over the city. Greg approached slowly, his breath shallow. When he was close enough to see the figure clearly, his knees nearly buckled. It was him. The doppelganger's face was pale, its eyes sunken and rimmed with shadows. It turned slowly, lips curling into a tight, joyless smile. "Don't lose focus, Greg," it whispered, the voice perfectly mimicking the one from the well. Greg stumbled backward, his hands clawing at the wall as the figure dissolved into a mist that slipped through the glass, vanishing into the night. He didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Instead, he returned to the well, seeking comfort in its whispers, desperate to drown out the echoes of his own fractured mind. Greg's days turned into a haze of trading and sleepless nights. His penthouse, once pristine, began to reflect the chaos gnawing at his mind. Empty takeout containers cluttered the marble countertops, dust settled over designer furniture, and the sharp, sterile scent of wealth gave way to a stale, musty odor. He barely left his apartment, his only trips reserved for the well. The Lamborghini sat in the garage under a thin layer of dust, its gleaming exterior a stark contrast to Greg's disheveled appearance. His once-trimmed beard was patchy, his hair unkempt, and his clothes hung loose on his thinning frame. The voice from the well remained his only constant. It had grown harsher, its once soothing tones now edged with impatience. Greg would sit by the well for hours, shivering in the night air, scribbling down investment tips and warnings of betrayals. The voice no longer offered explanations, just commands. "Sell your tech stocks. Now, pull your money out of real estate. It's a trap. Buy gold. Not through banks. Physical gold, hidden away." Greg obeyed without question. His portfolio transformed from a sleek, high-risk venture into a fortress of tangible assets. His accounts ballooned, yet he felt no joy, only the gnawing fear that it could all be ripped away. One morning, as the first light seeped through the drawn curtains, Greg's phone buzzed. He blinked at the screen, the harsh glow slicing through his headache. It was Ethan Rhodes. "Greg, we need to talk. Urgently." Greg's thumb hovered over the screen. His mouth was dry, his pulse a sluggish thud in his ears. The well's voice had warned him about Ethan, but curiosity overpowered caution, and he called back. Ethan's voice was sharp, words spilling out in quick, urgent bursts. "Greg, are you all right? You've been off the grid for weeks. Investors are talking. Some are saying you've lost it." "I'm fine," Greg muttered, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "I don't need their opinions." "Listen," Ethan pressed, "I've been hearing things, your trades, your moves. It's like you're inside the market's head. People are starting to wonder if you're involved in something illegal." A cold rush of adrenaline hit Greg. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you don't show your face, if you don't clear this up, the SEC might come knocking. You need to play this smart, man." Greg hung up without replying. His hands trembled, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the hardwood floor. He needed the well. Greg sped through the empty streets, the Lamborghini's engine a low, angry rumble. He barely noticed the red lights, the blaring horns, or the neon signs flickering in the early morning glow. His world narrowed to a single point, the dark mouth of the well. When he reached the clearing, he stumbled from the car, his foot catching on a root. He crashed to his knees, mud splattering his expensive pants. He crawled to the well, his fingers scraping against the stone. "Help me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They're coming for me." The silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Greg's breath hitched, his chest tight. He pressed his ear to the well, the cold stone biting into his skin. Finally, the voice came, but it was different. Hollow. Echoing. "They were always coming, Greg. You just never listened." Greg's vision swam. "What do I do? Tell me what to do." The voice chuckled, a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves in the wind. "You should have left when I told you. But now, it's too late." "No," Greg moaned, his nails digging into the stone. "You said you'd help me. I helped you become rich. But power always has a price." Greg's mind raced. He thought of Ethan, of the SEC, of his fortune turning to ash. His empire, built on whispers, crumbling around him. "What do you want?" he begged. Silence. Greg's heart pounded, his pulse a roar in his ears. He glanced back at his car, the sleek lines blurred through his tears. He could run, flee the city, take what cash he could, and disappear. But he didn't move. Instead, he sat by the well, the cold seeping into his bones, and waited. The sun rose slowly, the first rays cutting through the mist. Birds chirped, the world waking up around him. But Greg remained still. His phone buzzed in his pocket, more messages, more threats, more ties to a reality he no longer understood. And as the day stretched on, Greg whispered to the well, his voice thin and cracked, hoping that the voice would answer. But the well remained silent. Greg stayed by the well until night fell. His mind drifted in and out of reality, lost somewhere between desperation and madness. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees looming like dark, twisted giants. His skin prickled with cold, but he didn't move. His phone had died hours ago, cutting off the last thread tying him to the outside world. No more messages, no more warnings, just the quiet hum of the woods and the well's gaping mouth, black and endless. When the voice finally returned, it was soft, almost kind. "You're still here." Greg's lips cracked into a brittle smile. "I have nowhere else to go." The well sighed. "I told you the truth from the start. I gave you wealth, but I never promised safety. I did everything you said. I trusted you." His voice trembled, the words falling into the dark. "Why are you doing this to me?" A rustle of leaves. The wind seemed to curl around him, gentle fingers brushing his skin. "Because you were already broken, Greg. I only gave you what you wanted, an escape." Greg pressed his hands to his ears, the cold stone rough against his skin. "Make it stop, please." But the whispers only grew louder. They layered over each other, a chaotic chorus of mocking tones. He heard Ethan's voice, his old boss Frank's grating laugh, the soft, disappointed murmurs of his parents. His own voice twisted through them all, warped and wrong. He stumbled to his feet, his vision swimming. The world tilted, the trees spiraling around him. His foot caught on the edge of the well, and he swayed, his arms pinwheeling. "Come closer," the voice coaxed. "You've always wanted to see, haven't you?" Greg's fingers gripped the stone. He leaned forward, the cold breath of the well brushing his face. The darkness below seemed to move, shadows writhing just beyond sight. In the black, he thought he saw faces. Pale and gaunt, their eyes wide and empty. They mouthed words he couldn't hear, their expressions twisted into masks of sorrow. The well whispered again, and this time, the voice was his own. Jump. And he did. They found his body days later. Some hikers stumbled across the Lamborghini parked haphazardly on the trail, its doors still unlocked, keys dangling from the ignition. Greg's body was curled at the bottom of the well, limbs bent at unnatural angles. His face was frozen in a strange, peaceful smile, as if he'd finally found the answer he was looking for. The media spun wild theories. The millionaire hermit, who had risen to fortune out of nowhere, whose trading patterns had baffled experts, now dead in the woods like a lost soul. Financial analysts speculated on his investments, on the abrupt sell-offs and erratic trades he'd made in his final days. Ethan Rhodes gave a statement to the press, his expression somber. Greg was a genius, but he was also troubled. We all wish we'd seen the signs sooner. The well, of course, remained silent. But the locals started talking. Old stories resurfaced, tales of the wishing well in the woods, where people used to drop coins and murmur their hopes into the dark. Stories of those who had heard whispers, who had seen things, who had walked away changed. And every so often, when the wind blew just right, they said you could hear the well whispering back. Some claimed it was just the wind through the trees. Others said it was the water, deep below, gurgling through old stone. But those who knew better, those who had heard the stories and felt the chill at the base of their spine, knew the truth. The well had found a new voice, and it was waiting for someone else to listen.